Here's a story about my Grandpa Jack. Here's how I remember him from when I was a kid. Nice old man, loved Reese's peanut butter cups, and always told great stories. By the time I knew him, he was a retired office supplies salesman who lived in Park Ridge, Illinois for most of his life. It was a far cry from where he was born, on a homestead in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho, back in 1916. Here are Grandpa Jack's parents, my great-grandparents, around the time they got married in 1915 in St. Mary's, Idaho. One day, Great-Grandpa Jack went into town to go buy a team of horses. He left behind his wife and his baby, and he withdrew the family's savings from the bank. We can never be sure what happened to Jack Moore, but my great-grandfather was never seen again. The local newspaper reported that he may have drowned in the river on the way back from town. This left 25-year-old Anna alone in the Idaho wilderness, on a homestead in the Bitterroot Mountains, alone with my infant Grandpa Jack. Baby Jack in tow, Anna hopped on the Northern Pacific Railroad and returned to her family in Michigan. Her adventure as a young homesteader at a sad end. The Homestead Act represents just a little sort of footnote in my own family's history, but I wanted to situate it in a couple of larger currents in American history. Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War. Now, it's noteworthy that this law was passed during the Civil War because the Republican Congress really wanted to ensure that there were settlers moving into the open spaces of the great American West that were settling with free labor, that is, not bringing slaves. Attracted by the dazzling prospect of 160-acre plots of almost free government land, more than 1 million American and immigrant families moved out to lands in the western part of the United States and settled under the Homestead Act. Less than a third of the homesteaders actually were able to stay on and keep their land for more than a generation. Homesteading was difficult, it was isolated, the land was often dry, and it was costly to ship crops to profitable markets. Now, even though this law wasn't successful by a lot of measures, it lasted for a long time, all the way from the Lincoln administration to the Reagan administration. And it's often sort of celebrated as this sort of hallmark of democracy in America. Anybody can get land for free. But there are some dark sides to it. Maybe the clearest way to see the problems with the Homestead Act is to look at the Homestead Act's evil step twin, which was a law called the Dawes Severalty Act, a law that was passed in 1887. Take the example of the Coeur d'Alene Indian tribe, the tribe whose lands my great-grandparents moved to in 1916. In the 1870s, the Grant administration had cordoned the Coeur d'Alenes off onto their own territorial lands in northern Idaho. Under the Dawes Act, however, that tribal land was broken up into 160-acre plots, each of which was assigned to a family. Once every family had their own farm plot of land, the rest of the land would be declared surplus. That meant that any of the land that was left over, some 3/4 of the tribe's land that wasn't assigned to individual families, would be auctioned off to homesteaders like my great-grandparents, meaning that the tribe's land quickly evaporated. Between the 1880s and the 1930s, when the law was finally removed, 65% of all Indian tribal land was declared surplus and seized by the government and auctioned off. For years, I've loved telling my students about the story of my grandpa and his brief foray as a baby homesteader. And I've always wondered, frankly, whatever happened to my great-grandpa Jack in this story. But I don't think I'll ever be able to think about this the same way again. Because this is not just a story of one family's trip into the wilderness, it's also a larger story of displacement and loss among native tribes who still live in this land today. This story from Idaho is just one little local story of a story that has been played out across the American landscape. So, until next time, Dr. Tim out.